good evening, everyone. Here we are talking the show. Uh, we are for another episode of Asking Mystery, which is hosted by Caregiver Sati. Caregiver Sati is an ICS, which is really better. Okay. So, yeah. So, Caregiver Sati is a great initiative, a wonderful initiative that aims to support the caregiver and it is such a wonderful thing that it gives offers of good services from a medical opinion to getting an assistant to even caregiver support. I am a caregiver coach for caregiver support. Caregiver coaching is specifically when we talk of your coach specifically to understand where they are, to get more self-connected. It is a form of self-care. Another thing that Caregiver Sathi does is host a lot of such series, which is one of which is Ask Me Anything, the series which we are doing today. Ask Me Anything is an interactive series with specialists to address queries and challenges. The monthly live sessions, which are part of this series, cover specific topics and are answered by specialists live on our channel. Topics range from medical conditions like dementia, cancer, mental illness, autism, etc., and to specialized care like palliative care and varied caregiving concerns. Today we have with us a very eminent specialist, Dr. Leena. Dr. Leena V. Gangolli is the Senior Medical Officer at Sukoon Nilaya Palliative Care Center, King George V Memorial, Mumbai, and a geriatric palliative care physician. She is a member of the National Task Force for Palliative Care, appointed by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of India, and the Maharashtra State Technical Advisory Committee for Palliative and Geriatric Care. She has a varied and rich experience behind her and just the right person to be on our episode today. So, welcome, a very warm welcome to you, Dr. Leena. And I would hand it over to you to introduce yourself even more and the topic for us today.
Okay, thank you so much, Preeti. So at the outset, I would like to acknowledge and thank Caregiver Sati for all of the wonderful work you're doing, especially because you're working in a field that's it's a space that's it has a lot of unmet needs, right? The needs of the caregivers. So I really want to acknowledge Caregiver Sati. I know it's been wonderful doing any sessions with Caregiver Sati, from the time I met Bhavna and Anish the first time. I know they're very committed, and it's been wonderful working with you. Preeti, it was lovely meeting you as well in the lead up to this session. And I also want to acknowledge and thank all of the family caregivers who are, on this journey with their loved ones, and whether it's physically present here or if because of the pandemic and other restrictions, it's been long distance. But I know that everyone is really trying their best. And I just want to acknowledge that too. And all of you who have logged in for this session or who may watch this later on, the recording of this, I want to thank you also, because I think the caregivers, the family caregivers, are certainly an essential part of the care team in palliative care. And I think it's being recognized more and more. And so I just want to thank all of you as well. To start about the topic for today. So I have been told that, we discussed this, the topic was on geriatric depression and loneliness. I'd like to take a little step back from that. I would like to acknowledge that geriatric depression it's a very important aspect of aging, and we must understand that it is not a normal part of aging. It is something which needs to be identified and managed. It can be managed with various interventions, which we will discuss. And I also want to acknowledge that one of the topics today was loneliness and social isolation, and how that feeds into our overall health and well-being. Having said that, I'd like to take a step back and look at aging per se, and look at a healthy approach to aging. Because what I feel is we need to approach this in a kind of healthy and holistic way. So what I find helpful is an acronym that I have come across. It's one of the acronyms used in Canada in elder care, and that is the acronym of PIECES. All right, it's PIECES, pieces. So it's like the way with a jigsaw puzzle, you have to bring all the pieces together, and only when you bring all the pieces together, you have a complete picture. You have your complete jigsaw puzzle. So similarly, when we bring all the pieces together in our approach to caring for our elders, we need to bring in all these holistic factors. So pieces. So let's look at what PIECES stands for. P is physical. Okay, so we need to look at the physical aspects of aging, physical health. So apart from your regular checkups, and you want to rule out any visual disturbances, any hearing loss, changes in the number, any development of cataract, etc. So you want to rule out any preventable and correctable causes for a person's, some kind of disability that the person may be facing. So you want to have your regular checkups in place, physical. All medicines should be reviewed to make sure that nothing is being given which would not be suitable for that age, which could lead to a risk of imbalance and falls, etc. One thing I'd really like to highlight in the physical aspects of aging is the very important role of exercise and nutrition. I think more and more there is recognition that exercise is medicine, movement is medicine, and the more we can bring activity into our day, the healthier we will be as we age. And I say this collectively because not only do I want us to take this message home for the elders who we are caring for, but also for ourselves, because even if we're all in our 40s and 50s or whatever we may be, we are all aging as well. So what happens is whatever lifestyle changes we are introducing now is also an investment for our healthy aging as well. Also, as we live longer and as there is more development in medical advancement, we're living longer, we're living healthier. So many of us will be caregivers and also be geriatric caregivers ourselves, which means we will cross 60 and we may be taking care of someone who's in their 80s or 90s. So you're going to have an elderly person taking care of a super elderly person, right? That's if it's a parent and child, but it could also be a spouse taking care of the loved one, and therefore the caregiver also has geriatric needs, and so does the person receiving the care. So keeping all of this in mind, I think healthy aging is the way we should look at things. Okay, so that's the role of exercise. Exercise, we could aim for at least 20 to 30 minutes of some kind of exercise per day. It could be walking within the house if that's safe. It could be doing just the staircases if that's safe. And if mobility is an issue, there are a lot of exercises that can actually be done sitting on a chair. It's called chair yoga, chair aerobics, where you can march in place. You sit on the chair and you can march, the legs going up and down, marching on the chair. You can get pedalers these days, which help you cycle sitting in the chair that you're in. There's a lot of options. So that's exercise. And nutrition is another very important aspect of healthy aging in the physical domain. Many elderly people think that they do not require protein, vitamins, etc. But you need to remember that as we age, the muscle mass begins to diminish. And as the muscle mass diminishes, and this is medically called sarcopenia, as the muscle mass diminishes, the risk of falls becomes higher, because these muscles are the muscles which are keeping the core strong and keeping the balance. And they're part of the balance mechanics. So as the muscles get weaker, the person is at a risk for falls. So nutrition, a good protein content in the diet. So nutrition and exercise are what is now seen as preventive for sarcopenia or muscle loss. So that is the P of pieces. I is intellectual. We need to look at our intellectual health as well. Many of us, after retirement, there's a sudden decline in the activity, in the socialization, etc. And this is being seen more and more as a risk factor for cognitive decline later on. So to invest in our intellectual health, it's very important to remain engaged, both socially and intellectually, with activities that we enjoy. So, for example, these days, more and more people are choosing, even after retirement, to take up maybe a part-time kind of commitment, maybe volunteer with the community, maybe spend time teaching your grandchildren or doing homework, or if your grandchildren live somewhere else, but if there's children in your building, maybe helping with homework, or getting out and doing things which engage you. And then, of course, even your own activities at home, you could work on math puzzles, you could work on word puzzles. Language is a very protective factor for cognition. So both speaking and reading are very good for the networks in the brain. And there is science showing that the more languages a person is proficient in, the more protective that is. So if you are, and I know in India, we speak multiple languages in addition to English and in addition to your mother tongue, and then you probably speak the local official language as well. So one thing that's found to be very helpful is to continue to read and write, and if possible, speak in as many languages as possible. Okay? So if you can get a newspaper, your English newspaper, a Hindi newspaper, and a newspaper of your choice, read it, stay engaged in that language, read it out loud so that you are actually practicing the words, the vocabulary. Be certain to keep writing. Many of us have gone into just typing these days and using voice recognition. We need to practice handwriting. Okay, so that's intellectual. And I see there are questions. I'll come to those in just a minute. I'll just finish the pieces model and then I'll just come back to the questions. So intellectual. E is emotional. Okay, so we've spoken about the physical domain, the physical domain, the intellectual domain, and E is emotional domain. Emotional domain is where depression and loneliness come in. All right. Emotionally, as we age, we become at risk because there are a lot of life changes that start happening. There's a change in our roles. We may be retiring. There's loss of loved ones. There's loss of one's siblings, loss of one's classmates. There could be major moves in one's life. We were in a particular family might have been in a city for their entire duration of employment, and then when they retire, they have to move to another city. So the entire group of friends, everything changes. So loneliness, depression, anxiety, these issues come up. We need to be aware of them and address them. Okay, PIE is emotion. C is capabilities. As we age, we have certain capabilities which start diminishing. So balance and gait may become an issue. So what we need to do is, for our elderly and for ourselves, we need to recognize what are the capabilities that are being lost and have to be compensated, and what are the capabilities that are still intact and need to be really optimized. Okay. I'll come to that with examples in a bit. The next E is environment. We need to make sure that our elders are in a safe environment. So the place that we would start with is home. Many of the falls that are preventable, that happen in the elderly, they happen at home, and they happen because of preventable causes. So we need to check that furniture, for example, is safe. You would want to avoid chairs with wheels. The computer work chairs that tend to have wheels are dangerous for the elderly because as they sit, the chair may move back. Okay, so you want to, check for furniture. You want to check for carpets and mats, which sometimes have a fold in them, or sometimes the edge of the mat has come up. that becomes a place where people trip. You want to check for slippery floors. Tiles that have just been wiped can be slippery. Staircases can be slippery. Bathroom floors can be slippery. So you want to check for all these, risks of falls. Similarly, as your elder becomes more, possibly more dependent, you want to make sure the kitchen is safe. Make sure that sharps are kept away. Any risk of fire, you want to rule that out. Microwave, someone should be operating the microwave for the elderly person because sometimes they may not realize that something can become very hot in the microwave.
Yeah.
In the microwave, it takes 1 minute to bring water to a complete boil. And I've had an elderly patient who was taking the water out of the microwave and the whole cup fell onto the person and sustained 90% burns here on the chest. So things like that need to be checked. That's E for environment. And S is social and spiritual networks. Again, a very important component in aging is having a good wide network of, even if it's not a lot of people, it's people who you can connect with fairly frequently, okay? Social and spiritual networks. So bringing all the pieces together would be considering physical, intellectual, emotional aspects of aging, capabilities, a safe environment, and spiritual social networks. So that's the pieces acronym. So I see that we have a question here. Are there any signs and symptoms we need to be aware of? Okay. So one thing so signs and symptoms, if I could just have a clarification, signs and symptoms of what that we
Yeah,
need to be,
that's what I think.
yeah.
But that was a beautiful thing that you brought in, that thing about pieces, because it's really it kind of reminds you of just the essential things that brings the
Mhm.
jigsaw puzzle together in geriatric care, and
Yeah.
that itself is a new thing, like in the sense, like, I mean, we all do it, but to actually like think of all the things that you are supposed, like, as a do's and don'ts and things that are essential. And as I heard you say, I mean, what struck me was that the entire thing starts much before you are actually in the elderly, labeling that just there, but it actually starts much before.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so just kind of bring coming to the actual topic of depression in elderly and loneliness. So I think the question that has come from one of the audience member is regarding that, and
Mhm.
I would just add to that question. Like, I mean, talking about depression, like, what are some of the myths that surround it, and again, yeah, what are the signs of, what could we look out for? Uh,
Okay.
yeah, when we
That's a
are
great
talking about
question.
this. Yeah.
So one of them, okay, so let's look at what depression is first of all. So depression is basically a mental and emotional issue, okay? But then so the other reason why I start with the pieces model is because one thing that's important is all these aspects, PIECES, they also interplay with each other. Okay, so depression, which we would consider in the E, okay, that's the emotional aspects of aging, it impacts the physical health. It impacts intellectual health. It'll impact the capabilities, social and networks. And similarly, it is impacted by those aspects as well. So they all interact with each other. So signs of depression in a senior citizen, or signs of depression, are basically um, a sense of sadness, a kind of loss of interest in activities that were at one time enjoyable for that person. The person kind of withdraws from those activities. They no longer find joy in doing them. Um, a sense of helplessness, hopelessness. There could be a loss of appetite, sleep disturbances. Um, Sometimes it could manifest as irritability, restlessness in the elderly person. Um, Withdrawal from usual activities, a loss of interest. So what we call, I mean, the medical term is something called anhedonia. So, hedonia, hedonistic, hedon means pleasure. So anhedonia means a lack of pleasure, like the person lacks interest or pleasure. They literally kind of withdraw into a shell. What's important to understand here, the number one myth that needs to be, there's two myths that need to be addressed here. One is that the myth is that depression is a normal part of aging. I'd like to correct that. Depression is common in aging, but it is not normal. Okay? It needs to be identified and addressed, and it can be corrected. Okay? It's a reversible and correctable thing. The next myth is often depression is mistaken for dementia. Okay? A lot of people, when the person becomes socially withdrawn, loses interest, might seem a little forgetful, people misunderstand that to be the beginning of dementia. And in fact, it's sometimes geriatric depression is even called pseudodementia because it looks like dementia. But what's really important to remember is it's not, because it's reversible, it's correctable. And that is why it is so important to pick up geriatric depression, because it's correctable and it can make a huge difference in the quality of life of both the loved one and the family around who loves that person. So it's very important to pick it up and address it. Now, how can it be addressed? So typically, there's something called the Geriatric Depression Scale, which is a self-reported questionnaire, and which is often administered if the elderly person is capable of answering for themselves. Otherwise, we ask a family member to walk them through and answer that questionnaire for us. It helps us screen for depression. We would check any medications and see if there's any medicines that need to be adjusted, or if there's any medical issue that needs to be adjusted. We had a patient at Sukoon, Nilaya who appeared to have depression, but we also, when we reviewed her medications, and this is something that happens very commonly in the elderly, is what's called polypharmacy. And that is that the patient has been through so many different doctors and so many different specialists, and each person has given their medication, and maybe somebody hasn't really reviewed that medication and what we call rationalized the prescription. So they've not made sure there isn't any duplication happening. The lady who we saw was on 8 different medications for diabetes. And so her blood sugar was often very low because of that. And because her blood sugar was very low, she would suddenly get low energy and seem to be disinterested in things. And everyone thought that there was some mental illness issue. And really, we just had to correct her diabetic medication. So the first thing we would do is check if any medication needs to be corrected. And often with the elderly, we like our medication to be go low, go slow. So we kind of try to get down to a low dose, and we try to also make sure that any increase is slowly done. The other thing we would look at is any correctable cause. Like we'd look at electrolytes. We would, you always check the correctable and the reversible first. Make sure there isn't something that needs to be corrected. And then make sure that, and then the interventions would be non-pharmacological and pharmacological. Non-pharmacological interventions for depression would be social engagement, therapeutic gardening, pet therapy. Sometimes something like, okay, so I know that in some places where there's space constraint, it may not be practical to have a pet. But if you have a bird feeder in your window, okay, you have a bird feeder in your box grill, just the idea of birds coming in every day to eat and just the sound of bird song. And there's actually studies in the UK and studies showing that the sound of birds has been found to be very good for mental health. So birds, some kind of connectivity with human beings, with nature, therapeutic gardening. So even if it's a small plant and you're watering it every day, that is found to be very helpful as well. And then, of course, if that doesn't work or if the depression is really severe, then we sometimes help with a little bit of medication, but that's done with great caution because in the elderly, you would want to be careful with medication. But yeah, so that's how we would approach depression and loneliness in the elderly. And what's happening now is more and more where families are no longer in the joint family setup, and maybe some elderly are living in a city and the children are in another city or somewhere else, is the need for community-based elder groups, right? Like you can have walking groups. So I know that there are some people in some of these places, like, Bandra, Seaface and even Marine Drive, where you have these groups of people who take walks together. So you can have walking groups, exercise groups, yoga groups. And at Sukoon, Nilaya, which is where we have our center, in we've been wanting to start a day center for elderly people to come in to spend time with other elderly people and have activities like yoga, games, cards, exercise, etc. We've been delayed because of the pandemic, but as soon as it's, as soon as we're able to start, we will be doing that, and it'll be a day center. So both elderly people who are very active would be welcome to come in as volunteers. Elderly people who need assistance would be welcome to come in to do activities and exercise. And it's something we're planning for because we realize that that's really required for the elderly.
Mm. And those are such important tips. I mean, thank you, Dr. Leena, for telling us important things. The myths that I mean, we normally, as you very rightly said, like we take it for granted. Sometimes we say that it is common, in old age, and these things happen. But the fact that it is not normal is something that I mean, at least should keep us alert to such symptoms. And you mentioned a lot of symptoms, and you spoke about long distance, in the sense like somebody is not there with their elderly parents, and then what can be done. And there's also another issue, which is like we are like a sandwich generation, really,
Mhm.
and we are all taken care of. We are kind of caught between a lot of things, which are career and kids and family, and even the care of our elderlies. What could be some of the non-negotiable, something that really should ring the bells, the alarm bells in our heads, when we are looking after elders, and and looking out for such symptoms, because these symptoms seem to be I mean, as you very rightly said, they seem to be very common. So
Mhm.
what are some of those really strong alarm bells that we should be looking out for?
So, alarm bells, one would be any kind of level of forgetfulness where the person is likely to put themselves at risk. Okay, so I'll put it this way. We always say that if you forget where you've put the car keys, okay, that's not forgetfulness. If you forget that you have a car, okay, or you forget what a car is meant for, or you forget the color of your car, that is forgetfulness, okay? So, or if you forget where you've put your house keys, maybe you've just put them somewhere and forgotten, but if you forget how to use the house keys, if you forget what your house number is, so that kind of forgetfulness is something that would be a concern. Forgetting to take medication or taking the same medication twice, that's an alarm bell, okay? Another alarm bell is if your loved one seems to be eating less. So it's nice if on a daily basis, if one could just check in. There's actually studies showing how it's kind of interesting that even a 3 to 5 minute call made every day has its positive impact. It takes all of 3 to 5 minutes, but just that checking in, right, and that connectivity is found to be very helpful. It also helps because you will pick things up very quickly. You'll pick up if it's a video call or if it's a FaceTime call, you'll even be able to pick up from the person's face. Do they have a sad face? Do they have a flat face? Do they look down? Okay, then you might want to look into that. Are they not eating properly? Are they not taking their medications? Have they become socially withdrawn? Now, of course, in the pandemic, that social withdrawal and social isolation was unfortunately part of the pandemic. But now, as we kind of move out of that, if you knew that your loved one went for their weekly bhajan session, for example, and you find out that they've stopped going for that, you might want to find out why. Or if someone was known to go to the club, or someone was known to go play their bridge or something, and they're not doing it anymore, then you'd want to look into why a usual activity is not being done anymore. Another real alarm bell would be a fall, right? You want to look into how that fall has happened. Was it an extrinsic factor? So was it something outside of the body? So was it like a slippery floor or um, badly placed carpet or something? Or was it an internal issue? Was it because some medication is causing dizziness? Or was it because this person's beginning to get dizzy spells? So a fall is definitely an alarm bell. It needs to be investigated right away, and it needs to be, whatever its causes were, need to be prevented. Yeah, and yeah, and as I said, malnutrition is a concern.
Mm.
Those are warning signs. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Because, I mean, like, and it's such simple things like a 3 minute call, if it really makes a difference, you know.
Yeah.
So that brings me to, the next, thing, like what are some of the risks, that go with depression if unattended? So, I mean,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, just a little bit on that kind
So
of
the
thing.
greatest risk with depression remains self-harm, okay, or self-neglect. So that would be something as eating less, not taking medications on time, to at some point suicidal ideation in the elderly. Uh, you know, that would be the greatest risk, and in the middle, then everything that falls in between. So the greatest harm with depression is really the lack of self-care, and almost moving to self-harm. Then so. And the again, studies show that often the death of a spouse puts the surviving spouse at the highest risk of depression. Um, it's grief and bereavement, but then from that they can move into depression. The weight loss is generally the highest following the death of a spouse. The risk of malnutrition, and generally, in general, the decline in health is very rapid sometimes following the death of a spouse or a loved one. So at that time, again, the loved one will need a lot of support. Um, yeah, and that would be the greatest risks. Yeah, lack of self care.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, doctor. And like, we hear a lot. I mean, our elders are people who have been independent, and who have led lives, full lives. And sometimes it's so difficult to kind of, you've often heard people say that, my dad just doesn't listen, or how do we start engaging them? How do we start removing conflicts with them? Do you have any insights on that? Like, how do we kind of reconnect in a way? Is there something that you want to, could you give us some tips
So
on?
yeah, so the tips will be very general because this would obviously be very case specific. But in general, remember one thing, as you rightly said, these were people who raised a family, right? They've after all raised you and me, and our parents have raised us. So it's really important to remember when we're dealing with someone, and even someone who's dealing with cognitive decline, for example, and becoming more and more dependent. Remember that there's always that sense of personhood in that person. All right, there's a sense of personhood and dignity and autonomy, and those are really important. I think what really helps is if we can just take that step back and understand that, as far as possible, we try to uphold this person's dignity and autonomy as long as they're not doing any harm to themselves or to anyone else. So, we've had this conversation sometimes with families where you have a multi generational family in the same house. So, the younger generation feels that a particular clock on the wall just doesn't look good there anymore, so they want to take it down and put something else up. For them, it's just a clock, and it's just the interiors of the living room. But for someone else who had put that clock up maybe 30 years ago, taking the clock down symbolizes the loss of autonomy. Okay, it's the loss of control. And all of us as human beings, we all have in us what we call a nucleus of control. We feel good when we feel in control of a situation. And this is something that even children show. Even a 2-year-old, if the 2-year-old is refusing to eat just out of stubbornness, that means that that child's sense of autonomy has overruled their sense of hunger, right? Autonomy is that important. Like even a 2-year-old will show autonomy. So that's something very, very human. And that's something that stays preserved, possibly till the very end. And so if we can just recognize that and find creative ways to work around it. And as I said, they've got to be creative ways to work around it. So, I had a patient who uh, there was a family and the loved one had dementia, and it wasn't safe for her to be doing certain things. Or, for example, she was a very dear Tamilian lady, and she liked wearing all of her very traditional Tamilian jewelry. But the problem was that she was under the care of caretakers, and there was an incident when one of her necklaces went missing. And so the family decided that it wasn't safe for her to be wearing all of her real gold anymore. But to take it from her would have been very traumatic for her, because that's just. So the family found a creative way of working around this. They bought very similar looking costume jewelry from a store that did jewelry for Bharatanatyam dance recitals. They went and got that. And when she'd gone for her bath and had taken off her real stuff, they replaced it for her own safety. And so what happens is there are creative ways to work around these. And I think the nice thing about being a family caregiver is you learn to think of creative ways to do things, because you know your loved one the best. So you know how best to work around doing what's good for them, but also upholding their autonomy and dignity. So how do you deal with
Yeah.
conflict? With that's probably a step. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the entire thing comes from, when you move with the intention of connecting and really understanding the other person, and
Yeah.
from there, I think all the creativity and all the understanding just stems from that. So yeah, of course that makes sense. Yeah, but like, a lot of elders amongst us in our society also live alone. What
Mm-hmm.
would be your tips for them? How could they do? What could they do to avoid loneliness, and how they engage themselves and avoid these things?
So yeah, so I think what would really be important is, even if it's within the community, it would be forming groups of like a social group. They needn't meet every day. It's found that even groups that meet twice a week, it gives that social connect. And for the rest of the week, it gives them something to look forward to. So, things like, you know, it needn't be like, some people have prayer based groups, so they'll get together for satsang, but it need not necessarily be religious. It can be groups that get together and read, for example. They might want to read a book and have a book club, or get together and walk together. Uh, you know, um, Basically, if they're living alone and if they're mobile, then they should probably be able to get out and be part of a group. And if mobility is an issue, then it would be good to be connected with, there are community based volunteer organizations that have volunteers who'll come home to do activities. Um, I know Caregiver Sati also has a respite uh, caregiver program. So, something like Caregiver Sati, or a number of groups in Bombay that are now working with the elderly, could have someone come home. And as I said, even if someone's coming home twice a week, or if you're part of a group that meets twice a week, that's found to be very helpful too.
Okay, so that's something that's quite an insight. That like you don't really need like an everyday kind of a social interaction. It is just that little bit, and we need to just start thinking in terms of what is the next easiest thing that I can do towards doing something for myself, which is important for me.
Yeah,
And
because
what about yeah, yeah.
yeah, Preeti, I just want to add here, the reason why I say twice a week, I mean, if someone can do something every day, that's great. But what happens is, sometimes if someone starts off with the goal of doing something every day, that goal becomes so overwhelming that they don't try to do it at all. Whereas if you start with something small, right? Remember, something small is always better than nothing at all. So even if it means once a week, and then slowly that becomes twice a week, but that's better than not at all,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So even an exercise group, a walking group, ideally one should be walking every day. But if someone says, okay, I'll at least walk on alternate days, they at least get themselves to that level of activity.
The next small step that you can
Yeah.
take in that direction. Yeah. What could you do? Like, I mean, I was just thinking about people who are like not themselves social, and
Mhm.
they find it difficult to go out and talk to people and interact with people and have groups and go to
Mhm.
satsangs and stuff. As caregivers, or like people who are taking care of them, what could we do to help them build support systems or groups for that purpose? Is there anything?
Yeah, so the good thing about a community-based group, like when a couple, like say 10 people get together to exercise, or 10 people are doing yoga together, maybe you can encourage your loved one that this is like social interaction is, it's almost like a prescribed thing. I mean, it's actually part of a healthcare plan. It's not about going out and making friends because you're a very sociable person and you like having friends. It's also because it's a need. It's very important. And one needn't even get into very personal conversations. If you're a very private person and you don't want to get into personal conversations, that's fine. But you could at least come to, for example, a day center where there's yoga or exercise, and just be there for an hour. And you never know, maybe a person who was always a very, reclusive person, they may actually enjoy something, and it might help them to challenge their comfort levels and, just try something. If that doesn't work, then there are a lot of online resources. For example, you can do chair yoga or chair aerobics, and there's lots of videos, by groups that are considered safe for the elderly. So these are like by universities in the United States and Canada, for example, post a lot of these videos. Someone could start with that first and even get into the idea of moving, watching a video and moving. And then maybe they'd be open to the idea of then doing this with a group and then going and, moving. So yoga, dance therapy, because I know a lot of people who are very traditional are close to the idea of dance therapy. Like they say, oh, I would never dance. But maybe it shouldn't be called dance therapy. It could be called exercise. It could be called movement therapy. But that's really vital. Like movement is medicine. Meeting is medicine. So people just need to understand that.
Yeah. Brings us back to the pieces that you mentioned in the beginning, and
Yeah.
how essential each piece of that pieces is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so like just moving on a little bit, and thinking about just talking about palliative care, and
Mm-hmm.
like, can you talk to us a little bit about palliative care and the mental health challenges around it, and like maybe like what could a family caregiver do to cope better with it? How, what could they do? So something around
So,
that.
so
Yeah.
Yeah, so remember palliative care. So there's a couple of myths, which, as a rule, we kind of clear in all of our palliative care talks. So the first is that palliative care is only for end of life situations. This is wrong. Palliative care starts from the time of diagnosis of any serious life limiting condition. So that's number one, a foundation truth about palliative care is it starts. And there's studies showing that the earlier it starts, actually the better outcomes, like the quality of life is better for the person who receives palliative care. The second thing that's important is palliative care was historically always associated with cancer. What's important to understand is it is actually for other conditions as well. So neurological conditions, neurodegenerative, so Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, stroke, motor neuron disease, pulmonary fibrosis, renal failure. All of these are non-cancer conditions, but they require palliative care as well. The third important truth about palliative care is that it's multidisciplinary. It addresses the concept of total suffering, so physical, social, emotional, financial, and spiritual suffering. And when you're going to address so many different domains, it needs to have a multidisciplinary team. So not only do you have the medical team, the nurses and doctors, physiotherapists, but a very important role of the family caregivers and the community, right? So when I say the community, I mean, for example, your relatives, your friends, maybe your neighbors. If you have a helpful neighbor who's willing to step in for an hour and sit with your loved one while you go out for your dental appointment, or you go out for a walk or something, that neighbor becomes part of your palliative care team. So even the person who's coming to offer respite is part of the team. And remember, palliative care depends on symptom management, making the person as comfortable as possible. And I'd like to add one thing to this. I feel that in palliative care, we tend to focus on, we always talk about the alleviation of suffering, right? Like we want to alleviate pain, breathlessness. So all the suffering and the distressing symptoms, we look at symptom management. There's a new way of thinking now with palliative care that in addition to dealing with the negative aspects of illness, so that's all of the distressing symptoms like pain, breathlessness, nausea, vomiting, there needs to be an element of positive thinking as well. So we need to also look at what gives this person joy, right? We're not here to only remove negative stuff. We're here to also look at how we can bring joy into, because serious illness does not mean that there can't be joy. So a person facing a serious illness might be very happy to see his or her grandchildren. She might like seeing her grandchildren in their first performance at school, or maybe a dance performance. I remember once one of our seniors saying that it gave her great joy to help drape her granddaughter in a sari for her granddaughter's first traditional day at school. These are little things that give joy to people. I had a patient who had difficulty swallowing, but she really wanted to have pani puri. And obviously, everyone was very worried that golgappas would be a risk for swallowing. But we found that if we made the mashed potato and the liquid in a spoon, and we just mashed some of the puri and put that on the spoon and gave it to her, it was like a reconstituted pani puri, and it gave her joy. So I think another thing we really need, a message I want to get out there for palliative care, is we need to focus on joy as well. And not only joy for the loved one, but then that joy spills over to the family caregivers as well. So, find ways to have little celebrations. Have your pani puri night, have your pizza night. I remember one of my elderly patients, when I met her and I said, "Is there anything else I can do to make you more comfortable?" She said, "Yeah." She said, "Can you tell my daughter-in-law to stop giving me khichdi?" She said, "I don't want this khichdi anymore. She's giving me khichdi and soup every day." I said, "Okay, what would you like?" She said, "I want pav bhaji." So I said, "Okay, we'll ask for pav bhaji then." So, just ways. And then what's interesting is when you see your loved one so joyful, that joy just spreads to you too. And as a caregiver, it gives you a real high.
So true. That's so true, and such a beautiful perspective. That, I mean, that's so true. I mean, palliative is, we used to think that it is about just taking away the suffering, but it's about giving joy. That's such a new and refreshing thought, and thank you for that. And you spoke about grandparents and grandchildren, and that brought me to, like, if you do you have any advice for the Gen Z, who are like, I mean, without even knowing and without even realizing, they are like actually caregivers for grandparents a lot of times, and like
Mhm.
their elderlies in their families and in their households. And any advice that you have for them, ways to connect, ways to have a different perspective, is there anything that you want to say to them?
Well, first of all, I congratulate them if they're so young and they're caregivers. Definitely more strength to them, and they're very blessed, because I think if we can raise a generation of people who are caring and compassionate, I think we're just doing a lot of good. Like not only for our families, but even for the community, for society at large. Sometimes when you look out, you can't help feeling that societies are becoming. I'm not saying it in a judgmental way, but there sometimes seems to be less care and compassion out there, and everyone is trying their hard to survive the rat race. They're trying their best to survive the rat race, and so maybe it's good if kids are also part of the family caregiving team. And yeah, as I said, just keep in mind dignity and autonomy and creative ways to work around that. And I think that should just, I think people can be very creative and they'll come up with nice ways to do things.
Both.
Just to give an example, I remember we had an elderly male, and um, he required adult continence aids, and when it was time for his grandchildren were aware of it, and his youngest grandchild, she was about 3, she used to wear diapers as well. So whenever it was time at night for his change, she would say to him that, I'll go change mine and you change yours. And I mean, she had been kind of, um, she understood that it was something that, she needed to step out for. But the way she put it probably made it less difficult for him to have to deal with that change.
Yeah, that's a pretty like cute lack of any other word. Okay, we have a question. The question says, my father-in-law is 88 and he almost never steps out of the house. The fear of COVID still seems to linger on his mind, and I can sense that he is lonely and I'd like to help. We try to engage him with his interests at home, but he refuses to engage. Any tips?
Okay. So if he refuses to step out for fear of COVID, and that's real, um, would it be possible maybe if you could get someone to maybe visit and come home for the social interaction, and then of course wear a mask and keep a social distance, etc. But maybe you could initially start with just inviting people he likes. So maybe 2 questions that are important are, who are the people you really like and who's important to you? And see if we can engage those people, see if those people could either come home or if they could do a FaceTime with this person. And surprisingly, I've seen a lot of my elderly patients, they adapt very quickly to technology. So FaceTime, if someone can set it up for them, then they're quite comfortable to FaceTime with loved ones. So maybe you can identify who the loved ones are that this person would like to connect with and FaceTime with them. Or if it's safe, then call them home. And maybe just start with that. Maybe the person won't step out this soon because of the fear of COVID. And that has really, people are really scared. So, okay, we respect that fear and we see if bringing people home would help. And, for those of you who are in Bombay, or even those of you who are outside of Bombay, we could help you. Sukoon Nilaya is, of course, it's a free service, and it's meant to help people dealing with any palliative care issues. So we could help you even with the tele-OPD. We could maybe have a more detailed conversation, understand your father-in-law's medications and any other things that need to be ruled out first to find out why he's not engaging. But just to give you a one-off thing now, you could definitely identify who he'd like to see and maybe invite them home or do a FaceTime with them.
Thank you. Those were important and useful tips. So I think a question or two, and I think so I think we would just to kind of summarize the entire thing and just to put a perspective to it. In terms of geriatric care, what are some of the non-negotiables that that go with geriatric care? What should people really have in mind when we're talking about geriatric care? Just
Yeah,
close.
so as I said, the safety of that person, regular checkups, you want to definitely make sure that you are preventing the preventable and correcting the correctable. So for example, if you notice that your loved one has stopped eating, one of the things you might want to rule out is just get a dental and an oral check done. Maybe there's an ill-fitting denture that's causing an ulcer, and maybe that is what's causing the person to eat less. Or maybe there's a loose tooth or a painful tooth. So remember, one of the non-negotiables is at least every year, now that the pandemic has settled and it's safe, every year there should be a complete physical checkup. Check the eyes for vision defects, check the ears for anything auditory, check the mouth for any dental issues, okay? Complete checkup to make sure that, frailty, balance issues are not, we need to rule out anything like that. So a non-negotiable would be, if not an annual checkup, as soon as possible, a complete physical checkup. Make sure all medications have been properly rationalized. Make sure the home is safe. So honestly, the non-negotiables go back to the pieces model. So, make sure that all physical things have been ruled out. Intellectually, make sure the person is engaged in some way. If they're to themselves, at least if they're at home, maybe reading newspapers in different languages. So just recapping, what I said about pieces. Emotionally, make sure they're engaged, that you're checking in on them every day if possible. Capabilities, you've understood if this person is mobile or not. Do they need assistance? You'll optimize what they can do and compensate for what they cannot do. Environment at home has to be safe, so check for all preventable causes of falls, burns, and sharps. So you would check all these things. And social and spiritual networks, like try to make sure that if there's some reading club or walking club or something which may have become dormant now because of the pandemic, but I'm sure they'll start again.
Thank you. Thank you for all those tips and all that information. We would love to have some more resources if you can. Like you could probably pass it and we could just share it with our audience. And uh, uh, and I like you have shared a lot of examples and do you remember any one heartwarming anecdote or something that is there from your experience which you could just use to kind of wrap up today's session on a warm note for everyone.
Yeah. I had an elderly gentleman that I was caring for, and he had dementia, and he had pretty much forgotten. He didn't recognize his children anymore. He didn't trust doctors to come and check him, etc. But he was very fond of mava cakes from a particular Parsi bakery. His wife had mentioned that to me. So whenever I was going to check him, I used to pick up some mava cakes from that bakery and go home to see him. And we would typically share a mava cake first, and then I would take his blood pressure and see him. So once when I was in a bit of a rush, I wasn't able to go to the usual bakery. So on my way in, I picked up some mava cakes from another place, and I went to his house with them. And I gave him the mava cake, and he broke it in half and gave me my half. And as he had his, he looked at me and said, "They cheated you today. These aren't fresh." And so I thought what was amazing was that the memory of what the mava cake should taste like was absolutely intact. And it was just a very magical moment when he did that.
Wow, what a heartwarming story. Thank you for that. Thanks for leaving with us with that feeling of warmth. And thank you for all the information that you've shared with us today. Thank you for being on our episode of Ask Me Anything. Thank you for all the tips. I'm sure a lot of people will benefit from this. Even if they're not watched today, I'm sure they'll watch the recording. So thank you from Caregiver Sathi. Thank you from me personally. And we hope to see you again. Thanks a
Yeah,
lot.
thank you again. Yeah, thanks, Caregiver Sati, for everything. And thanks everyone who attended this and those who will watch the recording later on. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.